Who are you? So, assuming that you're taking this title, you know ES5, or basically you know JavaScript. You might not know the latest versions and latest APIs, but you're a JavaScript developer. But moreover than that, you're an independent problem solver. One of the problems, for example, that you're going to encounter, which is not a big one, is that you need to install Node.js and NPM. We'll leave a link in the descriptions of this chapter, but you have to make sure that it's installed and configured before you actually take the course, because that's going to be the platform that we're going to be working with to develop our applications. Who will you be by the end of this title? By the end of this title, you're going to be a master of React reusable components, and that will entail also getting very familiar with JSX and ES6. And you'll be incredibly proficient in React.js. So how is this course structured? Basically, the course is structured into 5 modules or 5 chapters, and each one of them covers one fundamental topic, starting with creating your first JSX component and setting up your environment. Then understanding what's new, what is the process, what is the idea behind React, and how to work with it. We'll then dive deep into the world of components, moving into reusable components. Once we have all of these, we're going to go into a real-world example as we build out a single-page application in the last chapter of this title. So by the end of the title, you're going to have a single-page application running. Really, really cool stuff. Okay, so let's cover the first chapter, and really the first chapter is all about setting things up, setting up expectations, and creating your first component. So we'll set up our development environment and know the basics of how JSX works, and also implement our first component. In this lecture, we're going to go ahead and set things up, namely setting up NPM and Node.js, assuming that you've done that process of the initial installation itself. And then we're going to show you how to integrate Webpack, understand what it is, and get it running. So let's jump right into it. As you probably guessed, our goal is to create React components and really learn how to leverage them. Now, you could just start right away and just go through the React documentations. You'll find the JS Fiddle option with JSX. Now, the problem with working with this way is that it's really convoluted and it's kind of hard to work with this way, especially with our projects which will have multiple files. And also, we want to create reusable components that we could keep on our local storage that we want to be able to retrieve easily. So, for our sake and purpose for the run of this application, we're going to assume that you have Node.js installed and NPM installed. And by the way, when you install Node.js, NPM gets installed as well. We're going to work with the current version, which is currently a 6.22, and we're going to work with also the current version of NPM. Now, last but not least, you're going to need to have access to a terminal. Now, if you're running on Linux or on Mac, then you have no problem. You have terminal built into your operating system. While if you're working on Windows, make sure to check our links to also get Cgwig, I think it's called. Cgwig is basically, that's the name, and get it running on your device. Now, if you want to really learn in depth how to work with NPM and Node.js and how they relate to React.js, make sure to check my title, Full Stack React Development, which will walk you through the whole flow until you become a full stack developer. But we're just going to assume that you have NPM installed and Node.js. And by the way, the way you check that is just type node -v. If you see there that version, in our case it's 6.22, and NPM v as well, and you get your version, then you know that you have NPM installed as well. Now, when you install NPM and Node, you might have issues where things don't install properly. And the way you sort that out is through the documentation as well. You will find in the NPM documentation how do you deal with errors which commonly happen on Node. So just follow the instructions in the documentation in NPM, or check out my title, Full Stack React. But we're going to assume that you have Node.js installed, that you have NPM installed, and you have a terminal running. With that said, let's continue, and that you're familiar enough to roam around inside a terminal as well. Just the basics. So with that said, our goal in this specific lecture is to set up and configure Webpack. Now, Webpack, and by the way, it's also included in the links that are provided to the title to this chapter. So Webpack, what is Webpack? Webpack basically is a compiler that enables to automate different processes that involve your website. Now, why do we need that? Well, the basic idea behind setting up and configuring Webpack is because we're going to be running on the latest version of JavaScript. And we're also going to use JSX, and all these stuff which we're going to be learning and exploring and doing throughout the title are not supported on browsers. To be able to address that, we need to compile the code and basically revert it or convert it into ES5, basically making it available for most browsers. And we're going to make it work for all browsers, also browsers that don't have ES5 installed. And we're going to see how to do that. But for us to do that, we don't want to need to, every single time we take a peek at our website, that we need to compile, and then we need to go to the browser, and then we need to click on refresh, basically creating a lot of steps. So instead of that, this lecture, we're going to prepare the groundwork that will enable us not to click on refresh. All right, so with that said, let's go ahead and start with our project, and I'm going to go into my terminal. And by the way, I'm inside of my chapter 1, but if you don't care, already know how to set up and configure Webpack and Babel and all the great things that we're going to do in this chapter and beyond, you could start with the starter file, which has everything already included. Now, the only thing that I would say, and I'm just going to go into that folder here for a second, the only thing that I'm going to say is, if you decide that you're going to go this route and you don't want to learn all the process, which I urge you and encourage you to do so, when you're in that file, type npm install. What that's going to do, it's going to install all the things that we preset but is not configured. Now, with that said, I don't want you to do that. I think it's really important for you to be very familiar with the environment. So I'm going to go ahead and do all these steps with you on my own. Now, we're going to start off with basically an empty folder, and I'm going to already set here an empty folder with the source folder inside of it that has nothing inside. Currently, at this second, we're inside of our component folder of chapter 1. And what I want you to do is I want to type npm init -y, which will basically skip an interview process and automate and create basically a package.json file. Now, this package.json file will have all the descriptors that are for the application that will let it know basic things that it needs. I'm not going to dive too deep into it because, again, you could learn a lot more about NPM and all the different usages of this file through my title, Full Stack React. With that said, now that we have that JSON file configured, and by the way, that JSON file is right in the root of our directory, we have here package.json. Every time when we install new packages, every time when we install new things, that JSON file will get updated. So basically, right now it's empty, but in a moment when we're going to start installing things, you're going to start seeing that more information is being added into it. Now, in the process, while it's doing the installations of the things that we want npm to install into our application, what I want to do before that is I want to touch a file that we're going to be typing in, which is called webpack.config.js. I just want to create that file. Once I've created that file, and I'll look into my editor, you'll see that I'll have the file. It's nice and empty, and we're going to work on configuring Webpack. As the name implies, this is the configuration file that we describe the things we want Webpack to do. But before we even do that, let's go ahead and start installing it, so that way in the process, as things are being installed, we could start building up that file. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set npm install, and I'm going to say that I want to save this, but I want to save it into dev, so I'm going to type there --save-dev, which basically means that this is not something the live server is going to use, but our development of the server is going to use it. In another case, it's not part of the server, it happens as an exterior wrapper to the server. Or really, this is not what you're going to use in the production, but this is used really in development like we're doing right now. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to ask for Webpack. And I'm going to also make sure that I'm going to install version 1. something. So if there's a newer version, although right now there isn't, but once there's a newer version, that you'll install that version, because our code is going to be reliant on the features that are available in the version 1 of this library. So it's going to make sure that we have that. So what I'm doing here is I'm installing Webpack, and I'm installing the Webpack dev server, which is going to basically create a live server for us that will enable us to automatically refresh our content and recompile on the fly, which is incredibly cool. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to go ahead and start that installation process. And as the installation is going on, let's go into our editor and let's start playing around with that config file. And let's get introduced to basically the way you export things in Node. Well, in Node.js. And the way you do that is, and it's similar if you've ever played with CommonJS. So it's basically the CommonJS standard, where you type module.export. And what I'm doing here is I'm sending out an object. In this lecture, we set up Webpack and started configuring our development environment. In the next lecture, we'll continue down that path as we learn how to configure Webpack Development Server.